I thought I would actually focus in on one specific thing and spend more time on that. The way I'm going to do this is actually I'm going to start off with a very basic introduction to what I think of as sort of the literature on community networks. Okay? And after that, I will tell you a little bit about, again, this sort of very sort of basic textbook literature on mutual insurance, which in some ways has motivated the paper that I'm going to discuss in great detail in these two lectures. Okay? Now, what I really would like to try to convey to you all is, in some sense, this sort of the challenge of actually coming up with a research question that is non-trivial and which at the same time is innovative and novel and yet connects to the existing literature. And I think all of you are smart, all of you know the methods, all of you know the techniques. Given the time, you can read a paper. I think the harder part for many people at your stage is actually coming up with an idea. And this is actually the hardest thing to teach you as well. And so let me try with this one example, perhaps, tell you a little bit about the history of this paper. This paper, the one that I'm going to talk about in great detail, has been kicking around for a long time. And one reason why it's been kicking around for so long is because it took us a long time to figure out exactly how to set it up. And you'll see as we go along. And the reason is because there is a sort of a very long literature on insurance, which sort of takes a very particular position, it takes a very particular tack on the question. And we kind of got stuck in that thing. And when we were able to get out of that, I think everything fell into place, as you will see. This is just one example, but I think it might help you in your own work as you go forward in terms of trying to think about how to formulate a question, how to go forward with your research. So let me start off, as I said, with just a very basic sort of introduction. And by the way, I hope that you guys will be interactive. I don't know how it has been in other lectures, but I expect you guys to ask questions and to answer my questions as well, okay? Okay, so if you go back, 20 years, like when I started, working on, just after I finished my PhD, working on these community networks, this was a time when, this was a field in its infancy. In fact, Sanjeev and Rachel were like two people I knew right from the beginning who were also working on, similar topics. And we were all kind of junior, I guess, at that point. So. Just 20 years ago. And at the time, there was sort of, there were two issues here. First of all, I think when I used to tell people about the work I was doing, they would often come to me and say, well, the first thing was, are these things really important? Why do they matter? That was the first sort of theoretical question. And then the second question, the empirical question was, how are you going to ever identify these things? So these are sort of the two problems that I had to grapple with at the very beginning, try to convince people. I think today things have changed very much. When you write a paper on networks, I don't think anyone sort of sits around and says, well, are networks really important? Do they really exist? I think that we've sort of taken that next step. We've now moved to another thing. But it's important to, I think, go back and sort of, go to the basics and ask ourselves, what exactly are these non-market institutions doing? And often, as I said, when you see a paper today on networks, you don't even think about that. You just have a particular network configuration, and then you say, well, now what's going to go on with that? What are the behavior going to be within this particular network? But you have to ask yourself, first of all, why is it that these particular institutions emerge in the first place? And my work has been mostly on what I think of as community-based networks, where you have a group of people who are sort of, either they live in a particular neighborhood, or they belong to a particular kinship group, and they support each other in different ways. That's the notion of network that I'm thinking about. Okay, so in this talk, we won't be talking about the architecture of the network, the topology of the network. We'll be literally just saying there is this group of people who are connected to each other. And my interest from the very beginning was to sort of ask myself, well, what do these institutions do? Like, why do they emerge, particularly in developing countries, but not only in developing countries? And what role do they play in the development process? And so the first question that you have to ask yourself, of course, is, why do these institutions emerge? And the answer to that, of course, is because there is some imperfection in the market. Either you have an information problem or you have a commitment problem. So think about, for example, the labor market. And this might be something very obvious for you all. I'm going to start off very slow, and then we'll get into more details as we go along. But the first question here would be, in a labor market, for example, why would you see a role for a network? Right? So what is for example, what's the information problem here? Think about someone who just shows up in the labor market. What is the problem here that you might think? What's the information problem? Is this something, can someone tell me? What would you think would be the answer to that? What's the...
You don't know the quality.
You don't know the person's quality, right? So there's sort of an adverse selection problem here. You might imagine that there's a bunch of losers who show up in this particular market. You don't know whether they're good or bad. What's the moral hazard problem here? What's the commitment problem here?
Once they show up, even if they're good, they might not work hard.
Precisely. So there are many kinds of activities where these people left to themselves are not going to put in effort. Now, what is one solution to that? What is a non-network solution to the commitment problem? Can you tell me?
Provide them a piece rate.
Right. So one way that you can do that is you give them a piece rate contract, right? So you just condition their outcome or their payoff on the output that they produce. But again, there's going to be many kinds of activities where you can't do that, right? What is the other solution that you can think of apart from piece rates? Where perhaps, if suppose you can actually observe the person's effort ex post at the end of the period. What could you do in that case? What's that? Yeah, backload. But let us assume that you have to put the wage up, give the wage up front, right? So we've built in this problem there. Yeah, exactly. So you have you have a repeated game, right? So you basically say, okay, now we know that this guy has this incentive not to put in effort. We're going to have a repeated game, and so that's going to solve the problem. Now the problem, of course, is that you might have a situation in which people are just going to be working for, let's say, one period or a small couple of periods at a time. You can't use this particular strategy. Let's say that you can't use piece rates. What do you do in that case then? This is where the network comes in. So how does a network work? Can you tell me what would be the mechanism? How would a network actually function in this environment?
You ask your peers to recommend somebody who had done a good job for them?
Exactly. So what you have now is a system of referrals. So someone who is actually, has a position in this firm, who's an incumbent worker, is going to provide a job referral for someone from his own network. Now, he has the ability to punish that person if he reneges on his obligations, right? And he doesn't put in effort. Why does he actually do that? Because he's got a reputation to maintain with the firm that he's in. And so now what you have is this network which basically solves, and this is a very basic role for networks which you see all over the world. Okay, this is not just in developing economies, it's even in developed economies. This is exactly, one of the major roles that these networks play. Okay, now tell me about insurance. How do you actually, what do networks do in terms of providing insurance for their members? So the first question to ask is, what is insurance? And I'm going to get into that momentarily. But the basic ideas I'm going to show you is that if an individual is risk averse, then they prefer to actually smooth out their consumption over time. So if I'm going to get, $1,000 with probability 0.5 and $2,000 with probability 0.5, I'd rather get $1,500 every year versus getting my consumption bouncing around between $1,000 and $2,000, right? So what does the insurance arrangement do for you? What it does for you is it effectively pools all the income that's generated by the members of this network, the insurance network, and it redistributes that total income on the basis of some pre-specified sharing rule. Okay? So that basically is, imagine now again with this simple example with, 1,000 with probability 0.5, 2,000 probability 0.5. If you have a very large number of people in the network, then what you could do is you just redistribute so that everyone gets 1,500 every period, and you've completely smoothed out your consumption. Okay? Now, in this kind of context, why does a network emerge? Why do you typically see people who know each other very well, who are socially connected, forming these mutual insurance arrangements?
Well, to hedge each other against the risk, or to hedge each other against the risk.
Now, I understand. So you would like to get a bunch of people together to smooth out the risk, right? But why would these people, when they get together, all be socially connected? What's the problem that you're facing here? What's the commitment?
You need some sort of enforcement, because if you give the guy something today and the guy doesn't really care about you, and then next period you want something from him, it'll just be done.
Precisely. So remember here, the way it works with this 1,000, 2,000 story is that those people who get 2,000 in any period have to give 500 to the pot, right? And those who are getting 1,000 are receiving 500. So the guy who's getting 2,000 is to give the money in, so there's always this sort of temptation for this person to renege on his obligation. right? Now, again, here you don't really need social ties. You could imagine just the repeated game sort of aspect could solve the problem to some extent, right? Because you expect to get some benefit in the future. But the additional advantage of these social ties is able to have social sanctions or punishments if you renege on your obligations. And that's going to raise the level of commitment that can be supported within this arrangement. And so this is a reason why communities are typically around, and there's a reason why communities still exist and why they're still very important. Okay, so at a sort of static level, you would imagine that this is the motivation. Again, you could look at any market. You could go to the credit market. You could tell a similar story there as well for why these kinds of community networks would actually emerge. Okay, that is the motivation for these networks. Now, how you actually identify a network effect is another story. Okay, and I'm not going to get into that. Maybe I should have spent some time on that, but for today, I'm not going to get into that. That's a whole other issue about how you actually tell. Sure, because if you just find that, for example, someone, let's say that you have a migrant in a labor market, and if you see a larger number of people from his community in that labor market, and if you ran a regression of his labor market outcome on the number of people from his community in that particular labor market, and you got a positive coefficient, that does not necessarily imply that there is a network effect, right? That could just be a spurious correlation where the size of the network is basically proxying for some unobserved characteristic, for example, that actually directly determines the outcome in the labor market, right? So that's the kind of stuff that you need to think about when you get to the empirical testing. But let's leave that for the moment aside, right? This is just telling you why, in general, in a developing economy where markets are not functioning perfectly, why you would expect these community institutions to emerge endogenously or spontaneously. Now, from a development perspective, when you think about, sort of the process of change, this is not terribly interesting, right? This is just a static thing. It's just a response to a particular, it's like a Band-Aid. There's a particular imperfection, and you have this, institution coming in response to that. What we ultimately care about, of course, is how can we change the circumstances of these entire populations or groups of people. And this is where the network is also very useful, because what the network does is it supports mobility. Okay? In particular, it allows people to move from one place to the other or from one occupation to the other. Right? So when you think about migrants, these are people who are newcomers in a market. So the kinds of problems that I was just describing for you in the labor market, they'll be exaggerated or amplified for that group, because people aren't going to know who they are. There's no way for them to sort of credibly say that, look, we're going to actually put in a lot of work for you, because you don't know who these people are. You don't know their background or anything at all. So this is precisely why, if you look at any labor market, even in a developed economy, when you look at migrants, they will typically arrive and enter and occupy particular niches where networks are very important. And the reason is because these networks can actually support them and allow them to find these jobs which they couldn't get on their own. And so in that sense, to the extent that this allows people to completely change their circumstances, go from farming into business, or go from the village to the city, or from a developed country to from a developing country to a developed country, what you're doing here is to completely change things for particular groups of people. Okay, and that's the sense in which I think these networks are really very important. And when I think about sort of the positive aspect of these community networks, it's actually in terms of actually supporting the mobility of their members, allowing people to move from one place to the other or from one occupation to the other. Okay? Now, yes?
Sorry, when you said about the networks in developing countries as a response to the markets not working,
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, isn't it the network was there first?
Well, that's an interesting question. So it's like a chicken and egg thing, right? Yeah. So at some level, I think the way you want to think about it, in many cases, the network wasn't there first, actually. So I'll give you an example. Think about urban labor market networks. These networks weren't there first because, in fact, there was no one there. Often, if you think about a developing country, a city, there was no city there, right? Then let's say there was a colonial power, like in India. The British came in and set up cities in the 18th century or whatever it is, right? And as they set up these cities with industrialization and urbanization, these labor markets started to form. And what you find is that, in fact, that networks that were providing insurance to their members in the village were transplanted to the city. And there they solved the problems that we were just describing. So in that sense, it wasn't that the networks were there first. The communities were there first. That's true. So what you're seeing here, in fact, is an economic institution that is emerging endogenously in response to these economic circumstances, taking advantage of pre-existing social ties. right? I think that's the way that I think about it. Now, this doesn't mean that these networks don't have an effect on the functioning of the market. And in fact, Rachel has a very early paper that looks at this idea that, if you have a really well-functioning networks, then of course the markets will be thin. And then you'll end up in this equilibrium where the markets don't develop because of the, of the presence of these networks. And we're going to talk about that in the paper that I'm going to discuss later on. So in that sense, you have to take, both sides of it. Okay? All right, so this is sort of what I've tried to give, what I've given you right now is just the sort of the positive side of these networks, right? At a static level, they're solving all these, imperfections. In a dynamic sort of way, they're kind of, allowing people to move from one place to the other, and then over generations, you can actually, oops, I don't know what I did here. I think I hit the wrong button or something. Oh, okay, anyway. Okay, and so over generations, they allow people to, change their circumstances. But of course, we're economists, we all understand that there's nothing like the market, right? So the moment you have a, non-market institution, you've got to expect that there's going to be some, collateral, some bad aspect to it as well. And that's true for networks as well. Okay, so one thing that one sort of, cost to these kinds of community institutions is their limited scope. The beauty of the market is that anybody can interact with anybody else, right? You could have transactions with anybody. It's just anonymous. If you think about the sort of classical market economy, it's a spot transaction, right? You just go in there, you buy the product, you sell the product, and you're done. You don't really know who the person is. It doesn't make a difference. What's different over here, of course, is that, when you think about these community networks, is they work really well, but they work within a very narrowly defined group. Okay, and this can, of course, create inefficiencies of their own. So I have this very old paper, actually, with Abhijit Banerjee, which I think sort of really describes the misallocation that can arise due to these restrictions on trade. So what we did in this paper, it's actually on the garment industry in a very small town in South India. And what we did, this is in the 1990s, actually, is we heard about this town. It's actually in the middle of nowhere. And it's like a production cluster. So at the time that we did the project, this one little town supplied 80% of India's knitted garment exports. And in that town, you had two types of entrepreneurs. You had people who were local farmers, who were very wealthy farmers from the local area, who had made lots of money through cotton, through cultivating and selling cotton. And this was over a couple of generations, actually. And these people at some point moved into the manufacturing side. Okay, and apart from them, about half the entrepreneurs actually were people from other parts of the country who belonged to traditional business communities. Okay, and what we did is we did a survey of firms in this industry, and what we discovered actually was quite interesting. What we found is that, in fact, these local guys, these farmers, they actually invested much more in their business. If you look at the capital stock, it was much more than these outsiders. But if you looked at the performance of these firms, what you found is that the growth was steeper for these outsiders than for the local guys. Okay, and in some sense, this was a puzzle. Because imagine, if you make the assumption imagine that the production function is very simple. It just consists of ability and capital, let's say. And let's assume that ability and capital are complements, which is not a terrible assumption to make, right? So what you would then find in a perfect world, if everyone was facing the same interest rate, is that those entrepreneurs who had higher ability would have also invested in more capital, and they would have had steeper growth as well. So the question is, how did you get this strange situation where there's this one group of people who are actually investing more, but the other group has a steeper growth trajectory? And our explanation for that was based on this idea that you have these community-based credit networks. And so these local guys, these farmers, for them, the capital is really cheap because they don't have really any very good outside opportunities for the capital. And so for them, the capital is really cheap. So you have a very low interest rate relative to these outsiders. But at the same time, these outsiders have higher ability. And so despite the fact that ability and capital are complements, what you end up with is a situation where, in fact, these outsiders are growing faster and these local guys have more capital. Of course, an alternative explanation could be that capital and ability are substitutes, in which case, in fact, the group which has, let's say, higher ability is going to invest less in capital or something, right? And we can show that within each of these communities, those firms which have more capital actually do grow faster. It's only when you look across the communities that you see this misallocation. So this is a paper that came long before this sort of, this new misallocation literature in macroeconomics. But it made, I think, this point that basically if you have these restrictions on trade across communities, then this can very naturally generate this kind of misallocation. Okay, so that's one sort of cost that you have. The problem with these, with these community-based institutions is they work really well, but only within their own group. They do a terrible, in fact, it's worse than that, because sometimes, you can even have antagonism or friction across groups, which can create all sorts of other problems, conflict, etc. That's another side to this, right? So they're very good, as I said, in doing things for their own group, but there are restrictions on their scope, and there's lots of restrictions on intergroup interactions or intergroup trade. Okay, the second problem with these institutions, as you might imagine, and this, of course, would be the traditional view of networks and community-based institutions, is collusion and nepotism, right? And this is something which this is completely natural, that people, as networks get stronger, they can support people who are weaker and weaker at the margin. Now, someone who doesn't belong to that group or belong to the network, who has higher ability, is going to get excluded. And that's a sense in which you feel like there is this, this favoritism, that someone from your own group gets to do better than he or she should, right? Because of this nepotism. So this is, this is the second problem. And the third problem, in fact, paradoxically, is the restriction on mobility. So I just talked about how these networks can actually support mobility of their members by moving as a group from the village to the city, or from a developing country to a developed country, or moving as a group from one occupation into another occupation. But what these networks don't allow you to do is to allow an individual to move on his own or her own. Okay? And often the reason for that is because there is a negative externality. If I'm part of a network, and if I leave, I hurt everyone who stays. And so they might really have a reason or incentive to keep me to stay. Okay? What I'm going to show you in the paper that I'm going to discuss in great detail is there are other reasons also why these networks can actually restrict mobility. But this is the mobility of individual members. They'll always allow groups to move. That's okay. But individuals have a hard time moving when they're part of the group. And this can have very large consequences as well. Okay? So this basically, to my mind, sort of summarizes the different aspects of these community networks. Why they form at a static, from a static perspective, what the dynamic consequences of that are in terms of mobility, intergenerational mobility, occupational mobility, spatial mobility, and what some of the costs are of these institutions. Okay? And I think all of these are good areas to work in. If you want to think about a research topic, for example, I think there hasn't been that much done on collusion and nepotism, for example. These are things which, which are clearly important. Anything that on misallocation or mobility, these are all sort of topics that are first order in terms of understanding the development process. And any way to sort of connect these institutions to these first order topics would, I think, be very important and useful. Okay?
So in the discussion, I think probe a little more. So these communities are, so I'm trying to understand the dynamics of these communities, if you like. So the way you were discussing this, it seemed as though the communities are quite, they're quite fixed. So how one would think, one might imagine that they would evolve. Is there a sense in which, is there work, or you probably thought about those things? You have something to add?
So I think, so that's a very good question. And I think the way that I think of this is that these communities are fixed. But what evolves is the networks within those communities. So the institutions, the networks are forming, and so not everyone in the community is necessarily part of a network. So there is a group of people who are sort of socially connected to each other, and then within that group, somehow within that population, these groups can form that support each other. And those groups can form, and they can strengthen over time, and they can get larger, and then they can collapse, or whatever it is. But that underlying community is fixed. Now, of course, that's an assumption, which may or may not be true. You could imagine that, in fact, the underlying population can also start to change over time, for example, as the networks become more or less. If you think about marriage, for example, as a way of maintaining these social ties, as the networks become less and less important, then you could imagine that these marriage ties will also start to break down, and then the community disappears as well. But in my work, I've always thought about these communities as being in some sense predetermined. It obviously helps a lot in terms of the empirical work, because otherwise you have nothing to build on. You really need some exogenous predetermined foundation upon which you can then start to endogenize the formation of different groups and outcomes and etc.
The networks are endogenous.
Exactly.
Can I just
Yeah.
add something to this? So I think that you were putting out some open questions for you guys. So another one here is how in the process of development, these networks may change form and these social links and the meanings of these different social relationships can change. So I've only seen one okay paper on this so far. So we talk about the importance of these networks or perhaps their costs, which I think Kaivan is wonderful. It's great that he's pointing that out. So, how when in the process of development, meaning perhaps the changes in institutions, trade, technology, and so on, may lead to changes in these networks. And I believe you even have a paper. You have a paper on this as well, right? The one on the education of girls and so on.
Oh, yeah.
Right, that paper. Right.
Yeah.
So it's how our opportunities can change the structure of these networks. And I think it's a fantastic question to be examining theoretically and empirically.
Good. So this is sort of my general introduction. What I want to do now is, as I said, I'm going to talk about one paper, but that paper is on insurance and migration. And so what I thought I would do is to give you just a very brief introduction to sort of these mutual insurance models, just for those of you who aren't familiar with them. Just because the paper kind of builds on that sort of basic framework. If you've seen these mutual insurance models, this is going to be quite boring for you, but it will be quick. So don't worry too much, okay? This is just to sort of give you, as I said, this is just the same example that I gave you earlier. This idea of like, why do you actually need insurance at all? Okay, and this is sort of a very fundamental point, which is that if you are risk averse, then you would prefer to smooth out your consumption over time. And the easiest way to think about this is think about a simple example where there are two farmers and the probability of receiving, there's two income realizations. Either you get 1,000 with probability 0.5 or you get 2,000 with probability 0.5. And if you have two farmers, there's basically 4 states of nature. They both get 2,000, they both get 1,000, or one gets 2,000, the other gets 1,000, right? So on average, if there's no, and remember, in these models of mutual insurance, the standard assumption is that there is no storage and there's no savings. So every period, you're sort of doing whatever you can, right? So if you're left to yourself in autarky, you eat what you earn. That's it. So in this particular case, if you are left to yourself, you would on average consume 1,500, right? Now what does insurance do, of course, is if you could get 1,500 every period directly, then the utility from that is obviously going to be greater than the expected utility in autarky, right? Which is one half of the utility of 1,000 plus one half the utility of 2,000, right? And you can see that from the figure. And where this is coming from, of course, is the curvature. So the moment you have risk aversion, you're going to benefit from insurance. Okay, so the one place where, if you're an empirical person and you want to write down models, I will often cheat and I will just assume that people are risk neutral. The one place where you can't do that is if you're writing models of insurance, obviously, right? It wouldn't make any sense. Now, I just want to also say something about the distinction between insurance and credit, just to be clear about what these two things are. So when you think about the sort of, classical or the canonical insurance model, as I said, you're going to be assuming here that there's no storage and there's no savings. And so in any period, basically, there's a group of people who come together and they smooth out their consumption as best as they can. And the way that they do that is that they take the income that's generated, put it into a pot, and then they spread it, they distribute it based on some pre-specified income sharing rule. That's the insurance model. With credit, what you have is a single individual who's interacting with some kind of financial intermediary. Think about a bank. And what you're doing is you're smoothing out your consumption over your own lifetime. Okay? So you know what your average consumption, your average income is going to be over your entire lifetime. The bank knows what it is. This is, of course, the classical model. And so therefore, you can just smooth out your consumption. Okay, so these are two very different ways, or two very different ways of actually smoothing out your consumption. And what's interesting is if you look at this literature, and I'm going to do the same thing in my model as well, is that you will typically go one way or the other. So when you're writing down an insurance model, you're just completely shutting down access to any other source of consumption smoothing. Of course, that's kind of crazy, but that's what you do when you write down the model. And in fact, when I take it to the data, I'm going to be implicitly doing that as well, which is kind of nutty too, but what can I do, right? It's what it is. Okay, but you guys should be aware of these things as you start to write down these models. There's a real virtue to writing down a simple, intuitive model. But then when you go to the data, you have to keep track of what you've made, what assumptions you've made, and at least try to correct or condition. And I'll show you, how we actually do that in the paper as well. So the trick is not to write down, put everything into your model. You don't need to do that. Write down a simple, intuitive, clean model which generates clean predictions for you. Then you can embellish it when you do the testing. You can say, guess what? I made assumptions A, B, and C. I need to just check, control for that when I get to the empirical work. Okay, that would be my sort of, suggestion for how you would write down a model. And you'll see that as we go forward, okay? But this is the motivation for insurance. And what much of this literature has done, and there's a huge literature, by the way, on mutual insurance. Much of it is in development because there's this idea that, these financial markets don't function smoothly. So you will typically have these informal mutual insurance arrangements which work, right? And so the initial work, and Townsend all of you must be familiar with Rob Townsend's famous paper in Econometrica. What he was doing essentially was to test for what is known as full risk sharing. Okay, what does that mean? With full risk sharing, what you do is, as I said, this is the third time that I'm saying it, but I think it makes clear what insurance is. With full risk sharing, what you do is you take the income that's generated. In this case, in every state S, the income is going to be Y of S. And you distribute that based on a pre-specified sharing rule. With log preferences, and I'm going to show later on what happens more generally, with log preferences, basically what you get is just some fixed fraction of the total income. So I could get maybe 1/10 of the total income. And Sanjeev would get 4/10 of the total income. And that's it. And whatever is the state of nature, that's going to be your share. Okay, this literally is what you would get with full risk sharing. Okay, so let's go back to this simple example with the two individuals. Okay, so remember there were 4 states of nature. With full risk sharing, what's going to happen, these two guys have the same income on average. So we could imagine that a natural sort of income sharing rule would give them equal weight. So lambda 1 would be equal to lambda 2, right, would be equal to 1/2. So in every state of nature, each individual is going to get 1/2 of the total pot that's generated. So look at this state of nature here. They both get 1,000, so the total income is 2,000. You just divide it up in half, so they both get 1,000. In this state of nature, they both get 2,000, so each one gets 2,000. In these states, the total is 3,000, so each of them is going to get 1,500. Okay, this is basically what a full risk sharing rule would give you. Okay? Okay, and now how would you actually test for full risk sharing? This is what some people now even call the Townsend test. Okay? And the basic idea is that at every point in time, which is basically one state of nature, your consumption, if you have full risk sharing, is going to depend on just you can think of it as the total consumption or the average consumption. Okay, this is what I just showed you earlier. The key point is that it will not depend on your income once you've conditioned for the average consumption. So think back, for example, to this very simple example over here. Okay, I think this will give you the right intuition. Oops. Yeah, so think back over here. So in these states of nature over here, right, what this full risk sharing rule says is that your consumption will depend on the average consumption or the total income, whatever you want to call it, which is either 3,000 or 1,500, it doesn't really matter. But it will not depend on what your actual income was in that state. Whether you got 1,000 or whether you got 2,000, it doesn't make a difference. You will still get 1,500. Okay, and that's the basic idea behind the full risk sharing. Okay, your consumption will move with the average consumption. It's independent of your own income or your own income shock. Yeah.
Sorry, the size of the community is totally discretionary. The size of the community they're considering is discretionary of the.
Not discretionary. This is a very good and very important point. So the way that this literature works is that it takes the size of the group as given. It's fixed. Yeah. And it takes the income sharing rule, the lambdas, as fixed as well.
How do you define a group? I mean, a group can be a village, can be a
Exactly. That's a great question. So in this literature, they really don't have a good way of doing that. So well, typically, a lot of the work in India, for example, they have, at least historically, they've defined it as the village. And what I'm going to argue as I go forward is that that's actually the wrong unit to use. But that's what they've done. And in these models, what's really important is that the size of the group, the n, is going to be fixed. And the sharing rule, the lambdas, are going to be predetermined as well. In our paper, what I'm going to teach you, I'm going to endogenize both of those. Okay, that's going to be the contribution, one of the contributions of that paper. Okay, so now if you just look at this, basically remember this was a rule that we had, right, with full risk sharing. And what you can do is you can go from this rule to this particular test over here. So all you do is you just take logs, and what you end up with is this expression over here. This thing here is fixed. This doesn't depend on the state of nature. So that's just a fixed effect, which is over here. This thing over here is just your average consumption. And n, the number of people, is fixed. Okay, we don't, that's exogenous. So that gives you this term over here. Now notice, once you have this, then the individual's own income in state S doesn't even enter into this expression at all. And so if you stick that in the regression, that coefficient alpha should be 0. This is the motivation for the sort of classical test of full risk sharing. Okay, now what you can do is actually to do this, more generally. This is a sort of the more standard, this is almost textbook material, okay? So for those, many of you will probably have seen this before. But now what you're doing is instead of going to 2 individuals, now you've got n individuals. You've got, different states. You should probably have some kind of discounting over here. I'm just summing over time. You can discount if you want. It doesn't really matter, right? It may change anything. But you're going to maximize what they call a welfare function, where these lambdas, they call welfare weights. What I'm going to argue later on is, in fact, that's a little bit of it's a little confusing to use those terms, but nevertheless, that's what they do, subject to the condition that the total consumption in each state of nature should be equal to the total income, right? That's what we're going to do. We're taking the total income and we're just going to redistribute it, right, based on some sharing rule, which is determined by these lambdas. So when you maximize this, what you end up with are these first order conditions. This is for any individual I, and this is for any other individual j. So if you take the ratio, you end up with this expression, which is very famous and very standard, which is that the ratio of marginal utilities between any 2 members of the network should be constant in all states of nature. That's the key prediction of risk sharing, full risk sharing. Okay? Now with log preferences, of course, you end up with a simpler expression, which is that the ratio of consumption should be constant in all states. And that's what I was using earlier for you, right? I just kind of gave that as a thing, but now you can see where the derivation comes from. And again, now if you take logs of this term, then what you end up with is this expression over here. You sum over all j and then divide by n, and you end up with this expression over here, and you're back to the test of full risk sharing. Okay, so I've just done it for you in 2 different ways. I gave you the simple example with 2 individuals. I've given you now the general example, but it doesn't really matter. You see where this is coming from, right? So the basic thing to remember here is that with full risk sharing, you're going to have this, you're going to take all the income, and they're going to just divide it up based on some pre-specified income sharing rule. And one implication of full risk sharing is that my consumption will co-move with the consumption of the group that I'm part of, but it will not depend on income in any state of nature or in any point in time. Once I've put in the fixed effects, and once I've put in the group consumption, which picks up for the common shocks. Okay? Now this is basically Townsend's, this was, I mean, it's not that Townsend, by the way, came up with this test himself, but this is the starting point for Townsend's famous paper. And what he does in that paper actually is to test this. And the way that he did this is he actually took data from what is known, it's known as ICRISAT, the International Center for Research in the Arid and Semi-Arid Tropics. So this is an international research institution which has got research stations in different parts of the world. And in India, there are 6 villages in 2 Indian states where ICRISAT has set up its base. And what they do in those villages is that they pick a sample of households. I think in the old days when he did the study, it was 40 households in each village. And they follow those households at very high frequency. I think maybe every couple of weeks, they collect detailed information about consumption and about income. Okay? Now, what's beautiful about this, of course, is that you have the full-time series for each household. The cost is you don't have a lot of households and you don't have a lot of villages. It's only 6 villages and it's only 40 households. But what he does is, and these again, this is also very famous for those of you who do development. These are sort of the famous Townsend pictures, where he basically what he does is on one axis he has time. This is from 76 to 1984. And on the other axis, what he does is to rank households by their income in the first year. Okay, so if you look at the first year, you can see this is just increasing. But then what he does is he keeps the same order, and he looks at other years later on. And what he finds is, in fact, that it's not smooth. If, in fact, the rank order was the same over time, then this would be a very smooth thing. But what you're seeing is that this is bouncing around a lot. And what that's telling you is, in fact, that households that are richer than another household in 1 year or have higher income in 1 year may not have the higher income in the next year. So there's a lot of variation in these incomes over time. So the idea is that there's a lot of idiosyncratic risk. Households do well 1 year, they do badly another year. And in fact, it's not just common. Sometimes I do better than you, sometimes you do better than me. And so therefore, there is opportunity to actually smooth out consumption. Okay? And if you look at consumption, now he's cheating over here because he's only using grain consumption, by the way. This is the least discretionary part of your consumption. So you would think that that would change least of all. What he should have done, of course, is to use all consumption. But now what can you say, right? It's in the paper. But nevertheless, what's striking about this is that unlike the income, this is really very smooth. And so his argument is, guess what? These guys have managed to smooth out their consumption in some way. In the paper, he doesn't talk about the mechanism. He has the test of full risk sharing, which he's going to implement momentarily. But he doesn't talk about what is the underlying mechanism. What is it within the village that does it? It could be a combination of insurance and credit and who knows what else. He doesn't really care about that. Okay? The y-axis here is rupees. It's the consumption. Yeah. And so that's what he's saying is that, look, it's really smooth, right? It's not changing over time. Those households which consume more than another household, they stay above the other households always, right? I mean, that's, yes.
It says deviation from village average. Does it mean village average at a particular point of time or village average at a particular point? Just can imagine if you take the average across different years.
I think he's probably doing it, I'm just bullshitting now. I don't know what he's doing, but my guess is that he must be doing it in each year. He must be looking at the deviation from the village average in each year, is my guess. Okay, so this is, okay, let me just skip this because this is so nutty that I don't even want to tell you what he did. Okay, well, so basically, let me just tell you, this is,
So are these households, are they very poor? So would one expect that income fluctuations would affect grain consumption?
I don't know how, they might be quite poor because this is, as by definition, a semi-arid region. So they might, and in fact, they had rain-fed agriculture, so you could imagine. But I think this is also a region where you had lots of fluctuations in income over time. And so this is precisely where you might have imagined that these insurance networks would have been actually quite well functioning to smooth out the consumption. So I think his point is that, look, here you have a place which, and this is like in the 1980s when you really didn't have any rural banking in India. And so there were no formal institutions. And so the question was, how is it that these guys were able to do that? And he doesn't really have an answer to that. I think we have the answer to that in the paper. But he's able to find stuff. And other people have found this, by the way, as well. There are anthropologists, for example, who have looked at the consumption of Indian households after a famine, for example. And what they found is, in fact, that they get lots of transfers from outside the village, from their caste members, from their relatives, which help them smooth out their consumption. So there's clearly something going on over here, which is outside of the market. Okay? Now, this is basically the coefficient on the household income. Okay? Remember that regression that I told you about, the test of full risk sharing? So what you have is, you have the average consumption in your group, you have your own household income, and you have a fixed effect, right? So this is panel data. And what he's showing you here is, just look at the first row, don't worry about anything else. These are just different, these are 3 different villages, and you could use any of these, it doesn't really matter. But the basic point is that the coefficient on the household's own income is very small. It's 0.07, 0.05, 0.11, 0.06. Here it's even smaller. It's minus 0.007, 0.12, 0.21. So in general, these are all different methods. You don't need to worry about how he does this, how he differences out the fixed effects. Sometimes he does within, sometimes he does first differences. It's irrelevant. The point is that these coefficients are very close to 0. However, in some cases, they are significant. And so his conclusion is that you have very high levels of risk sharing, but it's not perfect. You don't have full risk sharing. And there have been many, many, many studies that have been conducted since he did this, which actually look at risk sharing in different parts of the world. And they all come to the same conclusion, which is that you have very, very high levels of risk sharing. Sometimes, in fact, some recent stuff which doesn't use the village, this is also the ICRISAT data, but which uses the caste as a unit. And this is a paper by Maurizio Mazzocco and Shiv Saini in the AER a couple of years ago. What they find, in fact, that you cannot reject full risk sharing at the level of the caste, but they can at the level of the village. So if you get the social unit right, and you do the test right, then in fact you cannot reject full risk sharing. However, what the literature has done, and this is important for you all at your stage, is to look at where literature is going and decide whether this is really a good avenue to proceed or whether you want to switch and do something else. So what happened, what would you think? I mean, once you have this result, which looks like you have very close to full risk sharing, what would have been the next step in a research program? It's not obvious to me that you would have tried to focus on why you actually deviated from full risk sharing, given that you were almost there. But what you have is this huge literature which emerged over the next decade or so, which was trying to understand why you actually rejected full risk sharing. And what they did was to sort of go back to the information and the commitment problems that we discussed up front in the beginning. So remember here what we had said, the reason why you have insurance arrangements organized around these well-defined, well-specified communities is because of the commitment problem. So there's going to be some states of nature where I get high income and Sanjeev gets low income, and I've got to give him something. And the problem here, of course, is that I always have an incentive to deviate, right? What helps me, there's two things which prevent me from deviating. The first is that I know that he will help me in the future. So there is a sort of reciprocity, right? It's a repeated game. And the second is a social sanction. But nevertheless, if you cannot support, there might be situations in which, if, for example, my income is just way, way higher than Sanjeev's income, for example, or if the social sanctions are not strong enough, we may not be able to actually get to the point where we're actually smoothing out our consumption completely over time. You take the simple example where you have 1,000 and 2,000. When I get 2,000, I may not be willing to give 500. I may be willing to give 300, but not 500. So now you have a deviation from the first best. So one way to think about that is that in every state of nature, there's going to be a participation constraint. And if the participation constraint binds, then of course, what that means, of course, is that now my income, you're going to end up with the second best arrangement, where they're going to give you, you won't get your full income, but you'll give some of your income into the pot, but not all of it. So your consumption will, in fact, now move with your income. And that is why you're rejecting the test of full risk sharing. Okay? So one way to think about that is what they call sort of static limited commitment, where in every state of nature you figure out exactly where the participation constraint is binding, and that determines, in fact, what this coefficient is going to be. But then you have other work, give me 1 second. You have other work, which what they call dynamic limited commitment, where they actually think about more sophisticated stories, where, for example, if I get 2,000 and you get 1,000, I give you something, but then in the future, if we both get 1,000 or we both get 2,000, for example, then what's going to happen is you'll give me back to maintain the same ratio of marginal utilities over the subsequent periods. Now it starts to look like a hybrid between insurance and credit. And so there's a whole literature which has kind of looked at those kinds of things. But the point is, all of this literature is in the context of these very minor deviations from full risk sharing. And so the real question for me is like, is this really important or not, from a practical perspective? It's interesting theoretically. Of course, this is beautiful, and you can write down there's this very lovely paper by Ligon, Thomas, and Varall, the Review of Economic Studies, where they talk about this sort of dynamic limited commitment. But as I said, all of this is in the context of the initial test of full risk sharing, where you actually get really close. And so whatever these guys are doing is, at some level, really quite marginal. There was a question at the back.
Sorry. So I was just wondering, so you think about participation constraint, would there be incentives constraint as well? Yeah, of course. So you could imagine that what you're thinking about is income could be endogenous, right? Yeah. So basically what this literature does is to assume that incomes are exogenously determined and that there's no information problem. Everyone observes that. So they really focus on the commitment problem. Once you start to get into this issue about the income being endogenous, then of course I might not put an effort.
And there's a whole other issue with that as well, right? And again, as I said, this is the whole thing about these literatures. It's almost like there is a sort of implicit, there's a code of conduct. So I was actually at this conference in Barcelona. I'm digressing slightly, but it might actually be interesting. So, and I was part of this. It's like a summer thing, but you have many different sessions going on. And I was part of this development session. And one of the days I decided I would go to another session on, it was like labor search or something. And it was really striking to see the difference between the two sessions. So in the development session, all they did was to talk about identification. If you had this discontinuity, were you identified, were you not identified? And they went on and on talking about that. In the labor thing, it was a different story. It was nothing to do about identification. There was a group of people who worked on these search models, and they all had a code of conduct about what you could do and what parameters you could have and what you couldn't have. And it's almost like the sociology of our profession, that you have these things which are allowed and which aren't allowed. So in this literature, for example, it was all about the commitment problem. And they basically shut down, the incentive issues that you're talking about. They shut down the information problems that, might have been there, and just focused on this. Yeah.
I have a question. How did it actually deal in the paper with the fact that the assumption with respect to the storage that no alternative storage is available?
Sorry, what is it?
How did they deal in the paper with the fact that full sharing has an assumption that?
As I told you, that's built into the thing. But if you think about the original, the way that you develop the test, there's no storage, and there's no savings. And they just continue with that assumption over here.
So here they didn't address it anyhow, yeah?
There's no. This is it. This is the test. And that's the assumption that you make.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Another thing,
Yeah.
what did they actually assume on the consumption?
What do they assume on the consumption in the sense of how do they actually measure it?
Yeah, so
It's measured, as I said, the nice thing about ICRISAT is that they actually measure consumption in great detail. This is including durables and all goods. So they have a very good measure of consumption, which they're collecting at high frequency every 2 weeks.
but this is not a spending of the household. So this is actually what they spend on like ordinary items like food or clothing, but not reinvesting in their business or something.
Not in that business, but they will include durables. Durable consumption is included in that as well. Okay, so this is just the background. So how much time do I have? About 10 minutes?
No. You have full
No.
40 minutes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, 35 minutes.
Okay, good. That's great. So this is just the background. So what I want to do now is to now get into, you've seen the background. This is existing literature. And what I want to do is to now jump straight into this paper, which I'm going to discuss in some detail. Okay, and you'll see how this paper connects to this literature on insurance, how it connects to the literature on migration, which I talked about earlier, migration and networks. And you'll see how it actually literally is at the interface of these two literatures. And as I was telling you, at the cost of making me look stupider than you might think I am, it took us a long time to get to where we are with this. And the reason is because I couldn't get out of this trap of thinking about this ex post risk sharing. Because this is what I knew. I knew these models. I understood this literature. And so when we came to this paper, I just kept on trying to model it with this ex post risk sharing, which obviously was the wrong way to do it. And as you'll see now, I think it makes much more sense the way that it is set up. So let me actually begin by giving you the motivation for this paper. Like, why is it that we got to this, which I think is something important for you as well. So when you write a research paper, there should be some question that is actually important enough out there that you want to actually address. If there isn't a puzzle or if there isn't some broad fact, some stylized fact that needs to be answered, it's probably not going to be the most interesting, important paper. Okay? So for example, you might want to write a paper on labor market networks because we know, for example, that these networks are important in many countries. Then you can say, well, I know that if I write a good paper on that, people are going to be interested. And you'll see that over here. So what motivates this paper actually is a particular misallocation that we're going to actually document in India. Okay, so there is this new literature on misallocation. This actually really come up in the last 6 or 7 years, and this is a literature. This is a macro literature, really. So many of you will probably not be familiar with this, but it's a very high-profile, very rapidly growing literature. And there are many macroeconomists today who believe that, in fact, the misallocation of resources can explain much of the differences in productivity and income across countries. Okay, I think this is fair to say. Now, if you look at the early contributions to this literature, and this is the paper by Shea and Klenow in the QJE, and by Restugia and Rogerson, these papers were concerned with differences in productivity across firms. Okay, so the Shea and Klenow, there's a famous figure where they look at the dispersion of firm productivity in developing countries and in developed countries. And what they find is that there's much greater dispersion in developing countries than in developed countries, which means that basically there are less productive firms who can still stick around. And so the question is, why is this the case? Like, what is the consequence of this? More recently, you have work that looks at the misallocation across sectors, most notably the differences between agricultural and non-agricultural productivity. Okay? Now, this is, of course, is all a macro literature, and so the focus of this literature has been on making the connection between misallocation and differences in income across countries. What we're interested in this paper, and I think this is something which has received much less attention, is the determinants of the misallocation itself. Like, why do you actually have misallocation in the first place in a developing country? Like, what is it about that economy that gives rise to this misallocation? Okay? So, as I said, what motivated us were these stylized facts from India. So the first thing that we noted in India is that the rural-urban wage gap, corrected for cost of living differences, has exceeded 25% for decades in India. Okay, and I'm going to show you that in a second. Okay, now one explanation for this, which is our explanation, is that there is some friction which prevents people from actually moving from rural to urban areas. And for that reason, you can support this large wage gap. Now, why the friction arises is another question, which we're going to get into in the paper, but that's certainly one explanation. Another explanation, based on a very recent paper by Alvin Young, which is forthcoming in the QJE, is that in fact there's no misallocation at all. This is just simply sorting on unobserved skill. Okay, and he has a paper where he's using data not from India, but from across a huge number of countries, like 65 countries or something. And the basic argument that he has is very simple, actually. He says, suppose the skill intensity of production is higher in urban areas than in rural areas. So it's just saying, like in the Cobb-Douglas production function, the alpha coefficient, the coefficient on skill is just larger. So the demand for skilled workers is going to be greater in these urban areas than in rural areas. So what's going to end up, and this is unobserved, right, to us. So what's going to end up happening is that these high-skilled guys are going to basically move to the urban areas, and low-skilled guys are going to move away from urban areas to rural areas. So there's going to be movement, there's going to be this sorting in both directions. And what you're going to end up with is this wage gap, which reflects, and the more is the intensity of, are the differences in the intensity of, the skill intensity of production between the rural and the urban areas, the larger is going to be the wage gap, and the more movement you're going to see to actually clear the market. Now the point is that in India, as I'm going to show you, in fact, you're going to have this very large wage gap, but you're going to have very low migration, which is inconsistent with his story, where in fact you should be seeing lots of movement to actually clear the market. Yeah.
Actually, another point, I'm not a specialist on this, but maybe there is an issue how much they can afford, because it might be probable that in rural areas they can pretty much afford quite compatible lifestyle of what they should afford.
Sure. So what you really want to do for sure is to correct for cost of living differences. Yeah. So that, as I said, we're going to correct for that. I'm going to show you how we do that in a second. But I mean, adjusting for the cost of living differences, you still have a gap of 25%. That's the point, which I'll show you in a second how that works. Okay. So basically, as I said, his story doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the Indian context. In fact, I'm not even sure it makes a lot of sense in general, because he has this result which seems very odd to me, where he claims that 20% of people living in rural areas have actually resided previously in urban areas, and in the same number in the other direction, which I find hard to believe that you could get these kinds of numbers. And he gets this from the DHS. So those of you who might know the DHS know that this is basically a survey, the Demographic and Health Survey, which is primarily targeted at women. And he uses both men and women in his study. Now, in a country like India, for example, there is a lot of movement by women, but that's for marriage. 88% of women in India marry outside of their birth village. Now, you don't want to use women in an analysis of labor market wage gaps, because of course in many of these countries these women aren't working at all. So I wonder whether some of his results are being driven by the kind of data that he's using. But in any case, it's not relevant for us, because what we are finding here is two things. We're finding this large wage gap, which I'm going to show you in a second, and at the same time, very low migration. Okay? But the reason why I'm bringing this up for you is because when you write your own papers, when you do your own research, you have to be very aware of alternative explanations for everything that you do. So if you have a story, you really need to come back later on and think about the alternative explanations. And often those alternative explanations will basically arise very naturally by relaxing the assumption that you made to tell your story. Yes?
Well, I'm sorry, probably it's also accounted for, but another thing, the question is what kind of jobs these people are doing, because they have to be weighted in their own.
Absolutely. You're asking all the right questions. So let's look exactly at that. Rachel, I think you do have a question?
Well, I'm just interested in the word permanent.
Yes. So that's right. So I will get to that later on. So we're being very particular here about permanent and not temporary.
Because there's some interesting facts about the U.S. Immigration from Europe to the United States in the 1880s and 1900s and so on. And apparently the return migration was extremely high. So a third of the people who came to the U.S. went back.
But the question is how long were they there? So when I say temporary, what I mean is seasonal.
Seasonal?
Yeah. Permanent means you're going away. You could come back in 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is. The reason why we're going to use permanent is because the kinds of problems, these information problems, the commitment problems, are going to be more severe for someone who's moving away for a long period of time, as it will be clear as we go forward. So we're focusing on a very particular type of migration here, not the temporary or seasonal migration, the circular migration that people are familiar with. So for example, the work that I did in Mexico with the Mexican migrants, that's all temporary. They basically go there for a couple of years and come back, and they're part of this sort of circular movement. That will solve many of the problems that we think are driving this result. So that isn't, you'll see that, yeah. Okay, so let me just get to exactly both the points that you made. So what we're doing here is to look at the wage gap corrected for cost of living differences. And what we're doing is to focus on a very particular group of people who have less than primary education. Now, why is it that we do that? It's because of this concern that she just raised, which is that it could be the returns to education are just very different. If I have high school education, for example, and I'm sitting in the village, what am I going to be doing with it? If I go to the city, perhaps I can get a completely different kind of job where I can actually use my education in a particular way, and that is why I'm going to get differences in income. What we really want to do here is to look at a group of people. In some sense, what you're picking up is you're trying to crudely pick up the intercept of the Mincer regression. People who have almost no education at all, who are doing essentially similar kinds of jobs in the village and in the city, which is some kind of menial, labor, physical kind of occupation, is the kind of thing we have in our minds. So we're restricting attention to these people. And the first column is just the nominal wage gap, without correcting for cost of living differences. And what you see is a huge gap. It's close to 50%. In the second and the third column, what we do is to correct for the cost of living differences by taking a rural consumption bundle or an urban consumption bundle and pricing it based on your rural and your urban prices and then deflating the wage accordingly, right? So what you can see is that the urban wage gets deflated both times as a result of that, and the gap goes down to somewhere between 27 and 35%. But that is still a huge difference for people. You're not moving from India to I don't know, Botswana or to Switzerland or something. You're just going from your village to some other city in India, and you could increase your income by 27 to 35%, and you're still not willing to do that. Okay, how does India compare with other countries? Okay, so this is just using nominal wage gaps because that's all we can do to compare across these countries. But this is data from at roughly similar points in time. This is from 2004 in India, 2007 in Indonesia, 2006 in China. And what you see is that in China and Indonesia, the wage gap is about 10 or 11%. And as I showed you in India, it's close to 50%. So clearly something is going wrong over here, right? There's something going on. And the second part of our story, as I told you, is it's two things. One is the large wage gap, and the other is the low migration. So let's look at the migration. Sorry, before I do that, let's just look at changes over time. So this is just using the same NSS data, correcting for inflation, as well as for cost of living differences. Now this drop from 1999 to 2004 is only because they just redefined what was rural and what was urban. So certain areas that were rural were then redefined as urban, which is why you see this drop over here. But otherwise, nothing has really changed over this time period. Okay, and what I just showed you earlier was in fact the minimum point. which is about, as we saw, what, 35% or 27%, right? Okay. And now let's look at the migration rates. And again, what you find is that India is very exceptional. It has exceptionally low migration rates. So these are migration rates that are constructed from the Indian population census, which is conducted at 10-year intervals. And the way that you actually do this is known as a census survival ratio method. And it's used by demographers, quite routinely, where they basically compare the population of a particular, like let's say men between the age of 25 and 35 or something. And they look at the change in that group, that cohort, from one census round to the next, adjusting for mortality, etc. And what you find is you can use that to get a sort of crude measure of migration from rural to urban areas. And what you find is that it's actually very low, somewhere between 2 and 4%. If you compare this, for example, to a country like Brazil, their rural to urban migration would be something like 13% or something. So there's huge differences between India and these other countries. And this is also reflected in urbanization. So if you look at urbanization in India compared to China, Indonesia, and Nigeria in 1975, it's kind of in the middle of the pack, right? These are all large developing countries, right? But by the time you get to 2000, it's fallen far behind. Okay? So as I said, when you want to work on a research topic, there should be something, some stylized fact, something interesting, something important that motivates you. Otherwise, you're just playing with yourself, right? I mean, it's not really that important. And here, I think, is what you're seeing here is, in fact, I think two sort of pretty stylized, important stylized facts. And what we want to do is to sort of provide you with an explanation for why you have this low mobility in India and why it is the case that these rural Indian workers have not taken advantage of these opportunities. Okay? So the story that we tell is based on a combination of well-functioning rural insurance networks and the absence of formal insurance. So Abhijit Banerjee and Andy Newman have a paper which kind of is in the same spirit. This is not their famous JPE paper. This is actually a less well-known paper in the Review of Economic Studies. And they're not thinking in terms of networks at all. They're just thinking in terms of access to credit from their money lender in the village, which you lose when you go to the city. And so their idea is that if you lose this credit and you go to the city, then you might choose, as a result, not to leave because you're not going to get credit when you move to the urban area. We have the same idea, but we're going to set this up very explicitly within the context of an insurance network. And that's going to generate very specific predictions, which are very different from what their predictions are. Yes, Rachel, sorry.
So if this is the explanation for India, can you go to China and say that these things are present in China?
Which things are present?
For example, what's missing in India is present in China.
Yeah. So I will not be able to do the explicit cross-country comparison, but what I'm going to argue, what I will try to do is at least convince you that there is something very exceptional about the Indian social structure, which is why I think these networks work exceptionally well in India. And that is the reason why you're going to see. So to remember this, it's a combination of two things. You need to have well-functioning rural insurance networks and the absence of formal insurance. So what we're going to argue is that if you look at the formal sector, there's no reason why you would think that India is, any different from Indonesia or Nigeria or China. Right. What's different is, in fact, the rural insurance network. And again, there's a specific dimension along which this network is different. As I told you earlier, there's studies around the world which tell you that you get almost close to full risk sharing. So it's not about the ex-post risk sharing. The difference is going to be in the size and the scope of these networks. You're going to have these networks organized at the level of the caste. And there's no country that I know of in the world which has the very particular social structure that you have in India, which will support these kinds of networks. So this is something which actually I've been pushing for many years now, this idea that caste networks play a very important role in India and in the development process with varying levels of success, I think. And one of the reasons I think why we got pushback was because people would often come to us, people from India, and say, well, do these things really exist? Are they really important or not? And we would keep telling them, but look, we keep doing these studies where we find that 95% of people marry within their caste, where we find these really strong results. Now, in the last year or two, there's been a bunch of genetic studies because now they have the ability, the technology to actually do this, with the genome stuff. They can actually do genetic studies and they can date when these patterns were in place. So it turns out that if you go back far enough in time, there was free mixing in the Indian population. But then for some reason, 1900 years ago, something changed dramatically in India, and people started to marry within these well-specified social groups. And today you have 4,000 distinct genetic groups in India. And these patterns have been in place, and they can tell from the genetic, they can look at the mutations and stuff and tell, they can date this. These patterns have been in place for 2,000 years now. So these are groups which consist of thousands of households, which spread over multiple villages, and you're going to see that when I show you some of the results. And basically, there's no country that I can think of which has this very particular social structure, which in turn would have supported these very well-functioning networks. Okay, and that is basically our story. Okay, so now what happens? Why is it that, given that you have these very well-functioning rural insurance networks, which could have been in place, now we know, for hundreds of years at least, the question is, why is it that these people are not able to move to the city? And I'll get into more details momentarily, but the basic idea is that the commitment and the information problems that I started with at the very beginning, those are going to be greater for a household with migrants. So if, for example, one or more adult males have moved to the city, and if this insurance network is going to treat this household as a collective unit, then it cannot punish that household as effectively as it can punish a household without migrants, obviously. Because there's one person or more than one person somewhere else that you cannot punish. And what that means is, of course, that the ability now for this particular household to commit at the same level as another household without migrants is not going to be the same. The second problem is an information problem, which came up with this issue about the incentives. Now, once this guy has gone to the city, then this household always has an incentive to sort of underreport the level of income that he generated as a way of getting transfers to move in its direction. And if this cannot be observed by the rest of the network, then there's going to be this information problem, which is going to also reduce the amount of insurance that this household is going to receive. And the basic idea that we have is that if the loss in network insurance is sufficiently large, then in fact you could end up with a situation in which you have these what look like arbitrage opportunities, where you can increase your income substantially by moving to the city, but you will not, because the income gain will be offset by the loss or your inability to smooth out your consumption.
So
yeah.
You were not here yesterday, but so yesterday Armin Falk presented a whole set of correlations.
Yeah. Right.
And I don't know whether the slides, I think the slides are on. But one of the things that he didn't have time to talk about it, but what I remember is that there's actually very significant, very, very large differences between China and India on most of the preference parameters, like risk-taking, trust. I don't know, maybe some of you remember the plots he put up. There were very significant differences in the coloring of these maps between India and China, and in fact other developing countries. And that's a very different way of thinking about the problem. But I just wanted to draw your attention.
Right. I mean, can you just tell quickly, what was that with the trust? Was it generalized trust, or was he looking at local trust within your own group?
We went through a lot of material extremely.
So it was hard for you to remember? Okay.
Tell you all the details, but what I do remember is that on most of the things he looked at, the coloring of these maps, which is what signified trust,
right,
risk-taking,
right,
risk aversion,
right,
etc.
Right.
In fact, it was very different for India and China, and also
right.
I think for Indonesia. I don't remember, and also Latin America. So it's a very different way of thinking about the problem, but you may want to look up.
That's a good point. Yes, because as you will see, I will be sort of focusing on one aspect.
That's right.
And I'm going to try to, but as I told Rachel, I will not be able to make the explicit comparison between India and China. So now, all the stuff that I told you, but I mean, it's not going to show up anymore, because now the rest of the talk is going to be just about India. And what I'm going to do is to essentially say, look, I have a theory, I have a hypothesis, and what I want to do is to test this hypothesis. So our story is basically that that households with permanent migrants, and I'll be very explicit about why it's permanent and not temporary, households with permanent migrants are going to lose access to these rural insurance networks. They will not be able to smooth out their consumption as well as they could previously, and as a result, they'll be willing to forego gains in their income by moving. Yeah.
So I have a question. Say I derive my personal utility from consumption, but I also derive the utility from just enjoying my evenings with people from my caste.
Sure.
How can you distinguish that?
You will see that. So these are the kinds of things exactly you want to think about. You have to always think about alternative explanations. The way what we're going to do is to derive predictions that are in line with our theory. And then we'll think about alternatives. I haven't thought explicitly about yours, but it's easy to rule out, as you'll see. You'll see why. Because they're going to be particular households who are going to benefit more or less from the insurance arrangement. And we'll test whether it's precisely those households who are more or less likely to have migrant members, right? Okay. So this is now talking about, I guess this gets to Rachel's question about the seasonal migration as well, is that, okay, so the way that we're sort of motivating this, tell me when to stop, Sanjeev, okay? I'll keep going.
Yeah, you have 10 minutes.
Okay.
Roughly.
Okay.
Well, I'm sorry, it's probably you'll explain it later, but one still around thinking about in terms of the commitment. This is also, so it kind of, to me, it seems to be an interplay between commitment and information problem. Because, for instance, if one member of the network moves to the city and gets $1 million, then actually creditworthiness of his family grows and their reputation within the community.
Sorry, I missed you.
I mean, there is also a question of interplay between information available and commitment required from the other members of his network. Because, for instance, if the information is fully available to the community, this shouldn't be a problem.
You're always jumping one step ahead of me, which is perfect, which is good, don't worry about it. But that's exactly the point here, is that one way to deal with this problem of commitment and information is to actually move as a group, right? Then you solve this problem. And in fact, if you look at the history of development and industrialization and urbanization in India, that's exactly what happened. If you go back, and I've done work on, in fact, this is the first paper that I have on rural, surprisingly, on the rural networks. And a lot of my past work is, in fact, on these urban caste networks. And if you look at the history of these urban caste networks, the story is that if you go back to the 18th century or so, when the British were in India, they were setting up new cities. You had early industrialization. There was a demand for labor in these cities. Where did it come from? It, of course, came from the hinterland, from the rural areas. And how did this work? The way it worked was that that groups of people from the same caste would move from the rural area to the city. Once they were in the city, they would find a particular niche in the labor market. This is no different, for example, from what Rachel was talking about, of these European immigrants to the US in the 19th century. It's always been a story about people moving as a group from one place to the other, right? And that's what I talked about right at the very beginning of this lecture as well. That is the history of migration in India. You had these guys who would move over, they would find a particular occupational niche, and often over many generations, people would keep moving in the same direction, right? And moving from the same caste from the village, moving to the city, right? So this is certainly one way to solve the problem, because if you have enough of the people in the city, then you can solve the information problem because they know what these people are, what each person is earning, and you can solve the commitment problem too, right? Because you can punish them. They're in the city, part of the same community, right? Now, what's the limitation of this, of course, is that this is again getting back to what I said earlier. There's a restrictiveness to these kinds of arrangements. This is restricted to those castes which happen to have formed networks in the city. And not every caste, remember I said there are 4,000 distinct groups in India. Not all 4,000 castes has in fact set up networks in the city. There are a few castes for historical, fortuitous reasons who manage to set up these urban networks. Once they set up the urban networks, then of course for members of those castes, it's easy to move. But for other people, it's not easy. And so that's the sort of, this sort of trade-off here. So you can always have, moving networks are very good at supporting mobility of groups of their members, but they're really bad at supporting individuals. And so there are going to be many, many individuals who basically don't have the support or the connections and who will lose their rural insurance if they move on their own to the city. And so all those people are going to be excluded. And so that's the sense in which this is not a perfect solution. There are limitations to this particular strategy. Now the other sort of strategy would be to actually have seasonal or temporary migration. And in fact, it turns out that this has been increasing over time in India. But what's the limitation here? The limitation here is, of course, that this cannot be used for jobs where you want to actually write down a permanent contract. And there are many jobs where you want to do that, where you have learning by doing on the job, or where there's some kind of moral hazard problem or something. You really want to then write down a permanent contract. You can't do that with these kinds of seasonal jobs. And then remember, once you have the seasonal job, how do these guys get their foot into the door once they end up there? It's through their networks. So if anything, these jobs will be even more dependent on the network than the permanent jobs. So there are all these limitations which mean that neither of these strategies, which are being used, by the way, is going to be a perfect substitute for the movement of individuals on their own when opportunities arise in the city. Okay, that's our basic story. Do you have a question?
No, I was just connecting this to your other work where if there's something in the source that causes a whole group to move.
So that's the point. So, but the problem, and I didn't mention that, but in my past work, one of the things that you find is that you need enough of a push to jumpstart the network. And so, where, those kinds of large enough common shocks are going to be quite infrequent, right? And that, I think, is a reason why every community doesn't have a network, 5 networks in the city, right? That's the reason. Yes?
Well, I don't know, probably you will again address it later, but another scenario which comes into my mind is the hypothetical scenario where perfect information would be available about individuals. So if we consider individual movement and we kind of assume that perfect information is available in his community on what he's doing and what he's getting, so then it also doesn't have to have any impact on his
Absolutely. So if the community had perfect information, then that would be solved. What we're assuming here is that when the individual goes on his own, and there's no one there in the city to monitor him, then the community is not going to have this information. If the individual moved with a group of people, then of course the community could use those other people to actually monitor him. So that's the basic idea that we have, is that you have this information problem as well as a commitment problem when he goes on his own.
But in a way, this is also chicken and egg problem, because as is perceived, the links in the community, so this links in the community just become stronger. So it's more of a self-enforcing cycle. So the more those people who moved even to the city would be keen to stay closer with their community rather than.
They would, but as I just said, is that you cannot, for all the people to move together, so the way you want to think about this is that individuals are getting idiosyncratic opportunities. Each individual gets an opportunity in some place somewhere else. The people from the same community are not going to necessarily get those opportunities in the same place. Sometimes there will be a common shock which allows them to all move together to the same place, to the same occupation, and then they can start up a new network in the destination. But for many, many situations, that will not happen. And if, in fact, there's no one from the same community around to monitor this individual, then you're going to have this particular problem.
Yeah, but I mean, as this ties gets stronger, I think also there will be more misallocation at the end.
There is going to be misallocation. That's what we're going to show you. That's exactly the point, right? That's where the misallocation comes from.
Yeah,
I think Kaivan, you might want to move on because you're running out of time.
Okay.
Do feel free to wrap up.
Okay. Okay. So let me now give you. So I've given you some background now. You know where this is going. Let me just give you some descriptive evidence on the role that these particular networks play in rural India, right? Because our story here is that when you have these migrant members, then this household is losing access to this well-functioning insurance arrangement. I need to give you some evidence that, in fact, these arrangements are well-functioning in the first place, right? Otherwise, what's the point? Okay. So this is data from 2 rounds of the Rural Economic Development Survey, and we're going to actually use. So you're going to see this, a lot in the next 1.5 hours when we return. So this is a survey that's been conducted by the National Council of Applied Economic Research in India at multiple points in time. So there are 3 survey rounds in 1969, 1970, and 1971. Then they did another round in 1982, then in 1999, and then in 2006. And we'll be using almost all of these rounds at different points in time in the analysis. Okay? What I'm showing you here is data from the 1982 and the 1999 rounds. And what they do is, the way that this is organized is that they pick a representative sample of villages, of Indian villages. It's a nationally representative sample of villages. And then the first thing they do is to do a complete census of all the households in those villages. Once they've done that, they use that as a sampling frame. And then they pick a small number of households in each village. And for those households, they collect lots and lots of detailed information. So what we're using here is that second stage. Okay, where it's a small number of households in each village, but for each of those households, they ask them whether they gave or received gifts or loans within their caste in the year preceding the survey round. So this is the year prior to 1982 and the year prior to 1999. And so the first thing you see is that 20 to 25% of the households report actually participating one way or the other in this particular arrangement. Now, what I'm going to show you in a second is that the most important role for these caste networks is to meet major contingencies, like if you have a major illness or marriage or something else. And those are things which happen very infrequently. So when I say that it's 20 to 25%, that's only in a single year. If you expanded this to 5 years or 10 years or even 20 years, then my guess is almost all households
would actually report that they actually participated one way or the other in this insurance arrangement. Okay? Now, if you look at the percentage of income that is sent, it's about 5 to 8%. And if you look at the percentage of income that's received, it's about 20 to 40%. Okay, that's not surprising because typically what's going to happen is when I have a major shock, it's not like one person is only going to help me. There's going to be like a bunch of people are going to help me. And the other thing to notice is that the people who are sending actually have higher income on average, particularly in the 1999 round, than the people who are receiving. And this is indicative of some kind of redistribution. This is not about shocks, okay? I'm going to tell you later on. This is on average, people who earn more, on average, are going to end up actually giving money on average to people who earn less, okay? And you'll see that later on as we get into the model. So this is just a preview of that. But the important thing to take away from this is that there is a high level of participation in these arrangements. And if you can actually see, they actually play a very important role for certain purposes. Okay? Now, if you look at all the transactions within the caste loans make up just 23% of the transfers by value. Okay? So most of it is just gifts, where basically someone from your caste, this could be your relatives. So just to be clear about, I think I should have, I'm very sorry. You should have asked me this, but what exactly is the caste, right? So basically the rule in Indian society is that you have to marry within your caste. As I said, this is something which happened, now it turns out, 2,000 years ago. Okay, this is the basic rule. And this is what we've been finding. I've done surveys over the last 15 years or so in different parts of the country, and you still find pretty much 95% of people marry within their own caste. Okay? Now, within this caste, some people will be close relatives, and other people will be very distant relatives because these castes are very large. It's like thousands of households, right? What we're looking at here is just simply whether someone within your caste gave you a gift or a loan. Okay? And as I said, the gifts make up the bulk of the transfers. Loans are just 23% by value. And even then, if you look at caste loans, they are next in importance after the bank in rural India in 1982. Okay? So the bank is the most important. If you look at all the different purposes, then the bank makes up 64% by value. But the caste comes in next, which is even more important than money lenders. Okay, and if you look at certain purposes, if you look at contingencies, which is like illness and marriage, or if you look at consumption smoothing, then the caste in fact is more important than any other source of credit.
Is there a way to look at family?
Well, we can't over here. However, in the IHDS, this is the India Human Development Survey, which is a representative sample of rural households, they actually don't have information on the caste, they have information on relatives only. I guess you guys always ask me 1 second before, but that's good. So the problem is for us is this is not good. It answers your question, but it's not good for us because of course it's going to underestimate the value of the caste loans. But nevertheless, you can still see that for contingencies and for consumption expenses, the caste is really very important. And this is in 2005.
Is contingency marriage?
It's basically marriage and major illnesses. Those are the two, I think, major things. And I know I'm working right now in South India. I mean, this is the thing. If you have a major shock, like an operation or something, it's got to be. There's no bank, nobody else. You can't go to the money lender because they have these crazy interest rates. So you're really stuck with your own group, right? And you can see the terms on which you can get these loans. This is a fraction of loans without interest. 30% of the caste loans are without interest. Without collateral, it's 60% of the caste loans. And 20% are without collateral or interest. And you see the same pattern here in the IHDS. So the caste loans, it's not just that they're very important, they're also received on very favorable terms. And so the idea is that if you, for whatever reason, had to lose this would be a real hit on your family. Okay? Now, as I said, what's key to this caste network is this underlying marriage institution. That's a prerequisite to participation because when you marry within your caste, you can be punished in different ways through your in-laws, through your social connections. And so clearly this is the thing which keeps this sort of institution in place. And if this is data from the 1999 round of the Reds, but this is retrospective histories of marriage patterns, going from 1950 all the way through to 2000. And this is exactly, as I said, what I've been finding everywhere. This is almost like the golden rule in India. It's 5% across the board. If you look at the IHDS, it's 5.3%. That's the number of people who marry outside of their caste. And it's stayed completely stable over time. And as we know now from this genetic evidence, this is what it's been like for 2,000 years. So think about that, right? Yeah. We've read about the genetic consequences of that. But
If
Yes. So the way you want to think about this is like a closed network. Obviously, I don't have links to every other member of my caste, but as long as some, and there'll be clusters. So castes are going to be typically, caste will not be in every village. There'll be some villages where these castes will be there, and they'll typically be living together in one neighborhood in the village. That cluster will be linked to other clusters through marriage outside of that village. And then those will be linked to other clusters. At the end of the day, the entire system is, and Sanjeev will probably know this as well, is that ultimately this entire system is sort of linked up. It's not that every person is linked to every other person, obviously. But there'll be some link to, somehow you can get somehow to everybody else within your caste. So when we think about this, as I said, I'm not going to be getting into the topology of these networks. I'm just going to sort of assume that there is this network in place which links all these people. And when we come back from lunch, we're going to talk about now about what predictions we can derive from this story, which we can actually take to the data. Okay, that's where we're going to be next.
Thank you.